Start by adding a drop of clean water to each of your color wells. And you're going to take each color and add a sample on the left-hand side. It's important to have a sample of every color so that you know what you're working with while you're painting. For the next section, mix a color, any color you want. And you're going to paint wet paint onto dry paper. And we'll come back to this later after it dries a little. Next, for wet on wet, you want to start with a clean water and just paint a layer of clean water onto your paper. So now the paper is wet. And we will add wet color onto this wet surface and see how it behaves. So I'm going to mix a color. And you should instantly be able to tell that this is acting differently than when I was painting on dry paper. We also want to see how a wet color will behave on top of a wet surface. So how will my paint behave when I paint a color on top of another wet color? And you can see that the edges of that shape that I just painted in the middle will bleed and get fuzzy. You will not get sharp edges when you're painting wet on wet. For dry on wet, we again want to start with a layer of clean water directly onto our paper. Followed by adding a color. Now, just let that sit for a moment while we go over to the dry brush area. So for the dry brush, you're going to dip into your paint and wipe on your paintbrush, and you want your brush to be mostly dry with just some kind of sticky, tacky pigment on it. And then you're going to brush across the paper with the goal of giving it some texture. It should look dry. It should not be very smooth. It should be kind of rough. And the paint should feel kind of sticky as you are painting. Now let's go back to our wet on dry. And what happens when you paint wet paint on top of dry paint? You can see that it's going to behave much differently than the wet on wet. You'll actually get sharp edges and a difference between the two shapes. All right, now let's go back to dry on wet. So again, I have a dry brush and my paper is still wet. And I'm going to paint dry on wet. Just kind of, again, see what happens. It should bleed some, but not nearly as much as the wet on wet. but that water on the paper will kind of activate the lines as I draw them. Okay, let's move on to bleeds. So start by adding a layer of thin, watery, okay, this is not dry brush, this is wet brush, thin, light colored paint. Okay, so yellow, maybe the light green, maybe that light orange. Okay, but keep it one of the light colors, or thin your paint a lot with water if you want it to be relatively light. And you want it to be nice and wet. Now, choose a darker color and paint a line or a shape or something. Again, we're kind of doing that wet and wet technique. And then apply some dots of color, darker color. You probably want to switch back to the flat brush for this, and you want to use the corner of the brush or dab at it to kind of get a little puddle of your color and see what happens when you create that little puddle. Okay, next let's talk about blooms. So for the blooms, you want to choose a dark color and add a layer of, again, pretty watery paint. This should not be dry brush. It should be nice and solid and relatively thin, but a dark color. And you can sort of play around with using a second color if you want. It can be solid or it can be a mixture of a few colors. It really doesn't matter. I think I was just bored with using solid colors. You're going to fill that box in. And now you will add drops of clean water onto the surface. And it might not look like it's doing anything right away, but watch that spot in the upper left-hand corner where I dropped the water, and you'll see that it is starting to push the color out to the edges. Some of these next things we're going to need to let them dry and come back to them later. So for masking, what I want you to do is add a rectangle of a light color near the top. Okay. And then for lifting, I want you to add a rectangle of a light color at the top of the box and a rectangle of a dark color at the bottom of the box. I'm choosing a blue because frequently we need to lift with skies when we're doing landscapes. And we need to let both of these dry and then come back to them. Same with glazing. Okay, you're going to add a light color on the left-hand side. This time I'm choosing light green just to mix it up a little bit. And you can always lighten your colors by adding lots and lots and lots of water and mixing on your plate if you need to. And let's choose a darker color on the left-hand side. I'm sorry, the right-hand side. So I'm making like a black forest green. While I paint this in, take a moment and look back at that bloom area. It's already it's continuing to change as I move on to other areas. Blooms tend to change over time. That water moves and flows and does more and more things to the paint. as you move on to other parts. Okay, lastly, let's go to that gradient box. Okay, for the gradient, what you'll be doing is, and this is sped up now, what you'll be doing is adding one color at one end of the box. And I'm again using this dark foresty green color. And it can get pretty dark at the one end. And now I'm going to add another color on the other end and sort of try to get the two to blend and mix together to create a transition from one color into another. Be careful not to overwork the paint. It can tear up the paper.